Hello everyone, my name is Max and welcome to my August wrap-up. So I'm going to be doing my August wrap-up a little bit differently than I usually do wrap-ups. I usually do them in order of when I read them, but this time I did decide to do it differently, and that is because I participated in the NEWTS readathon and they go by class. So if you are unfamiliar with the NEWTS, it is a month-long readathon hosted by G from Book Roast. This was the last year because of all the controversy surrounding J.K. Rowling, but I just had to participate. I have loved this readathon every year. I've participated and I have won. I have done every single challenge the past 2 years. I'm not going to tell you yet, but stick around and see if I completed it this year. Now, I did read quite a few books, so I'm not going to go into super big detail. And if you want to know more in-depth thoughts, definitely go check out my reading vlogs. I vlogged every week for the month of August. I've decided to do my wrap-up per class. So there are 12 classes and 3 prompts per class. And so without further ado, let's just get into it. So the first class is Ancient Runes, and the prompt for A, acceptable, is to read a book whose author's name starts with the letter B. For this, I went with Unbirthday by Liz Braswell. She is the author of all the Twisted Tale stories, and she finally did Alice in Wonderland. I got an ARC of this from NetGalley, so thank you so much, NetGalley. I was so excited, and I ended up giving it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I also participated in 3 other readathons this month, so I'm going to be going through each book and then talking about the 1, 2, 3 readathons that correspond with each of those books. And then on birthday, I went for Tome Topple to read my most recent tome. The next prompt for E, I listened to an audiobook of Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. This is a reread for me, and this was the first time I listened to the audiobook, and I actually really enjoyed listening to the audiobook. His writing is very dry, and I think like listening to someone tell it, it does feel like someone's just telling a story. NEWTS, this was to read a classic, and then for Scallywagathon, it was to read a book with mermaids or sirens. And I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, and I'm probably never gonna reread this again. I did find it very racist. That is an issue. And I honestly just didn't really like it that much. And then for the last prompt for Ancient Runes, I chose Meet Me in Mayfair by Tessa Dare, and for the NEWTS, it went towards read a romance. This was part of an anthology, How the Duke Stole Christmas, and I just needed something really short. I read it during my last week, and I was definitely kind of hitting a bit of like, okay, I'm a little tired of this. Let's just read some shorter books, and I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. On to the next class, which is Arithmancy. The first prompt, I chose Queens of the Conquest by Alison Weir. Now for the NEWTS, it went towards read a nonfiction, and then for Tome Topple, it went for listen to an audiobook. And for Avatar: The Last Airbender, for the Water Tribe, it went towards read a book with blue on the cover. Half of the cover is very blue. This followed 5 queens during the early England between 1066 and 1154. Honestly, did not love this. I found it pretty boring, which is so unfortunate. I don't really like rating nonfiction, but if I had to give it a rating, I'd probably give it a 3 because I liked the audiobook, but it was just so dry. And I've read a lot of Alison Weir before, and I've never had this issue. But for some reason, this book, it was a slog to get through. The next book for Arithmancy was another audiobook that I listened to, and it was The Realm of the Gods by Tamora Pierce. I read or listen to a Tamora Pierce book a month, and this was the book that I had to read of hers for August. It is the last of her second series about it's the Immortals series. And I really did enjoy it. And it went towards the NEWTS prompt to read a book that ends in an uneven page number. And I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And then the last prompt for Arithmancy, I listened to The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, and I ended up giving it also a 4 out of 5 stars. This is really crazy. It is about this family who's at this cabin for a holiday, and these 4 people show up and tell them that they have to choose which one of their family members to kill to save the world. And I was actually very impressed with the lengths Paul Tremblay was willing to go. Because a lot of times in books, even with a dark setting and premise, they still don't like to cross a certain line. Paul Tremblay, Nope, he didn't care. And honestly, I was impressed with that. I enjoyed that. You know, I was like, okay, hats off to you, Paul Tremblay, for going that dark. So yeah, and this went for the NEWTS prompt to read a book between the page numbers 260 to 299, and this was 272 pages. And now onto astronomy. The first prompt I chose Loneliest Girl in the Universe, which I ended up giving a 3.25, 3.5 out of 5 stars. And this went towards the NEWTS prompt to read a book with stars on the cover, and then for Scallywagathon, a book that exploded in popularity. Now, this was not popular recently, but when it did first come out, a lot of people were reading it, and it definitely kind of divided people. Either people really enjoyed it or really didn't care for it. I felt pretty average. I thought that, yeah, I don't even know if it's supposed to be a plot twist, but if it was supposed to be a plot twist, it was pretty predictable. But I liked our main character, and I liked the plot. The next prompt, I chose Monstrous Volume 2, and this was for the NEWTS to read a sci-fi. Now, I didn't really realize it was considered a sci-fi, but when I looked up sci-fi graphic novels, it did come up as one of the first ones to show up. So I thought, why not read it? I read the first one for NEWTS last year, and I really ended up loving it, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And then the last prompt for astronomy was my last read of the month, and that was Seven Blades in Black by Sam Sykes, which went towards the prompt to read the biggest book on your TBR. It is 690 something pages with the extra content, which I did not read, but I'm still counting it, and I loved this. I thought it was so, so good. I had such a great time reading it, and I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars. It is about a girl who's taking revenge against these 7 people, and I'm not going to tell you why, because it does say it on the back, but I think if you went in not knowing it, I think it would do a lot more, because you'd be wondering the whole time, like, okay, what did these people do to her? What happened? And I think that the reveal would have been really, really strong. It was already emotional reliving this scene, but I think if you didn't know exactly what they did to her, I think it would have been even more emotional. So I suggest if you haven't read this or looked up a synopsis, don't. Just go in knowing she is trying to get revenge against 7 people. And that's all I'm gonna tell you. 5 out of 5 stars, one of the best books I've read this year. For the next class, it is Care of Magical Creatures, and the first prompt I chose Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. And for Care of Magical Creatures, to read a book with fire on the cover. Avatar Last Page Turner, it was also to read a book with fire on the cover. And for Tome Topple, it was to read a book by a Black author. Now, I so wanted to love this, and I know people are very divided on it, but not for, I think, the reasons why I didn't like it. I loved the plot, I liked the writing, I loved the supporting characters, but I hated the main character. And if you saw my reading vlog, I literally went on a huge rant about this. I had so many, I feel like maybe half an hour of footage of me just ranting about this and ranting about the main character because I hated him. He sucked. Tao just screwed over everyone for mistakes that he made, and he just blames everyone for his own mistakes. He blames everyone for things that he did. This is about a guy taking his revenge against people who wronged him for things he did. And I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars just because of that. The next prompt for Care of Magical Creatures, I chose Goldie Vance Volume 3, and this went for the NEWTS to read something short, and Avatar Last Page Turner to read something with water on the cover. Now this cover it's one of multiple covers that you could choose for Goldie Vance Volume 3, and it has water in the very, very background, but I am counting it. And it is definitely my favorite Goldie Vance volume so far. These 2 characters who hated each other have to come together, and they realize each other, like both of them are much more deeper than they thought, and they actually start getting along, and I really, really liked it, and I end up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. And then the last book for Care of Magical Creatures, I chose The Rise of Kyoshi, and I loved it. This is in the Avatar universe about Kyoshi, who was the Avatar 2 times before Aang, and it was so phenomenal. This went for NEWTS to start a book with a snack, and then it went for Avatar The Last Page Turner to read a book with green or brown on the cover for the Earth Kingdom. I had to. There was a Nook deal going on, and then when Avatar The Last Page Turner happened, I just knew I had to fit this in, and I gave it a 4.75 out of 5 stars, I think. All right, for the next class, Charms, the first prompt I chose Lady Rogue by Jen Bennett, and this was for the NEWTS prompt to read a funny book. Now, did I really laugh out loud No. But it was definitely more lighthearted and there were funny moments, so I'm counting it, and I did really enjoy this. This is about a girl whose father goes missing while they are in Turkey, and a guy who they had a romantic entanglement and then disappeared comes and says, listen, we need to get your dad back. And they go on this great adventure. They're trying to find the ring of Vlad Dracul, and it's a lot of fun. I did enjoy it. I probably gave it about a 3.75 to 4 out of 5 stars. It wasn't amazing, but I did think it was a very fun, very lighthearted read. The next prompt for charms is to read a book set in winter, and I went with Where Dreams Descend by Janella Angelis. I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I keep either going between Janella Angelis or Janella Angelis, but I might be completely off base. And I ended up really enjoying this. This is about a girl who is able to do magic, and she escapes this very toxic boss-employee romantic situation to compete in a test to become part of this circus. And she's competing against 9 boys. She's the only girl, and it is just so much fun. There's people trying to sabotage her, there's romance, and it is definitely set in a wintry setting. They constantly complain about how cold it is, and I was like, yes! This was an arc that I got also from NetGalley, so thank you so much, and I ended up giving it a 4.25 out of 5 stars. Then Where Dreams Descend went for Avatar: The Last Pageturner in the Fire Nation to read a Latinx Own Voices novel. Then the last prompt for charms was to read a manga, and I went with Orange Volume 1. This also went towards Tome Topple to read a TBR veteran and an unpopular genre. And it also went towards Avatar: The Last Pageturner for the Air Nomads to read a book with an Asian Own Voices main character. Now, I did not like this, which is so unfortunate. I feel like so many people absolutely love it, and I just thought it was so average. I didn't like our main character. I really couldn't care less about anything that happened. I thought our main character was just so annoying and selfish. She gets a letter from her future self saying that she has to do specific things so that this new boy in class doesn't die. And she literally is told, like, reach out to him, and she'll be like, I'm sorry, my future self, I just can't do it. And it's like, okay, well, he's gonna die. So you're just gonna let him die because you're too shy? Because you just don't want to talk to a guy who has a girlfriend? Like, I just thought it was so cringy and just not good. Not good. I end up giving it a 2 out of 5 stars. The next class is Defense Against the Dark Arts, and the first prompt is to read a horror or a thriller, and I went with an audiobook, The Rook by Daniel O'Malley. And I loved this. It is about a girl who wakes up having absolutely no memory of who she is except a series of notebooks that explain everything. And she works for a supernatural sect of the government in England, and she has to figure out who's trying to kill her and who wiped her memory. And I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I picked up was for the prompt read a book with water or demons in it, and I went with Season of Storms by Andrzej Sapkowski. Now, there's definitely water, which I didn't realize until there's a huge part of the book that takes place on a river. And okay, monsters, they're kind of demons, right? I feel like they at some point call them demons. They're not actually demons, but there's definitely water in it, so it counts. And this was very disappointing. I feel like I liked the earlier books better in the Witcher series compared to the older ones, and this takes place, I want to say, in between the first and second books of short stories, because Ciri isn't in it yet, but he does reference Yennefer, so it's not before the series starts, which I thought it was going in. But I think it's just Andrzej Sapkowski's writing just stopped working for me because I didn't like this. And he wrote this after the series, and it was just so disappointing. It was so lackluster. I don't understand the point of it at all, and I ended up giving it a 2.75 out of 5 stars. And then the last prompt for Defense Against the Dark Arts was to read an epic fantasy, and I went with Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. You know, yes, this is epic fantasy because there is a big revolution going on. There's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of magical creatures, so I'm counting it. And it doesn't take place on Earth, it takes place in a whole different world, but this is about a girl, Nimona, who is a shapeshifter, and she starts working for the villain against the good guys, but then they start to realize that the good guys aren't really good guys. This was a reread for me. I did read this, I think, 2 years ago for the NEWTS, and I absolutely loved it, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And then for the next class, Divination, the first prompt is to read a book with a red cover, and I chose Fable by Adrienne Young. This is about a girl who was abandoned on this island by her dad, who is a very famous pirate. Lord, king, captain. But then one day she decides to escape, and she books passage with a trading ship who end up having their own motivations for taking her on. I did really like this. I really enjoyed Sky in the Deep by Adrienne Young, and this has definitely reinvigorated my motivation to read The Girl the Sea Gave Back. And this also went for Avatar in the Fire Nation to read, also a red cover, and I ended up giving it a 4.25 out of 5 stars. The next prompt for Divination is to look at your TBR and just choose the first book you see. So I went onto my NetGalley shelf and just was like, okay, boom, and it was 10 Rules for Faking It. I cannot remember who it's by, Sophie something. And this was, okay. I really liked the beginning. I really liked the prompt. It's about a girl who on her birthday finds out that her boyfriend's cheating on her, and she goes into her job where the DJ is singing your happy birthday, and she goes on this whole rant about why her birthday sucks, and it turns out it was all live. So now people are lining up to try and date her, and it becomes a competition where it's kind of Bachelorette-esque, but she is actually falling for her boss. Now the first, I want to say 60% of this was really good. It was really fun. And then the main character just really annoyed me. I also went on a rant for this one. If you want to go check out my Scallywagathon vlog, because this also went towards the Scallywagathon, I Captain to read a book with 2 eyes in the title. And I ended up giving it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. And then the last prompt for Divination was to start a book with T, and I chose Stepsister by Jennifer Donnelly. Now this is kind of what happens to the stepsisters after Cinderella becomes queen. And this was interesting. I didn't really understand the motivation of the villains, but other than that, I did really enjoy it. I thought there was an interesting commentary on war, and our main character has very good character development. I think probably looking back, I'd give it a 3.5, 3.75 out of 5 stars. All right, so then for the next class, it is Herbology, and the first prompt was to read a book with plants or flowers on the cover, and I went with Girl of Hawthorne and Glass. This was, again, an arc that I got. I found it very average. It's about a girl who was made of hawthorn and glass by witches, and she's an assassin for them. And she's usually sent out to kill ghosts. But when she starts to be sent out to kill humans, she realizes that they are seriously flawed. She gangs up with humans and witches to take them down, and I honestly can't really remember what else happens. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, but honestly I might lower it because it was so unmemorable, and I might be maybe 2.5 out of 5 stars. The next prompt was to read an impactful book, and for this I went with Dear Ijuwele, a feminist manifesto by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I really liked this. It is very interesting because it definitely focuses on Nigerian culture, which makes sense because Chimamanda is Nigerian, but I thought it was a very fascinating inside look into their culture. I thought it was very good. I highly suggest it, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And then the last book for Herbology is to read a book longer than the previous one. And I decided to take this for it's longer than Dear Ijuwele because Dear Ijuwele was only like 100 pages. And I went with My Calamity Jane by the Lady Janies. Now, in any other time, this would have been longer than most of the books, but I read this right after Upon a Burning Throne because I also read this for Scallywagathon to read a book that you forgot you owned. Now, this follows Calamity Jane in the Wild West, except in this version, there are werewolves. I did not love it. The first book is definitely still my favorite, and I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. All right, and the next class is History of Magic, and for the first prompt, I chose The Midnight Bargain, which was for a historical fiction, and I loved it. This is, again, one of my favorite books of the year so far. I absolutely adored it. It does take place in a different world, but it definitely feels a lot like our world, just if there were witches. So I did count this as historical fiction. I guess it'd be more historical fantasy, but fiction is all-encompassing, so I'm counting it. But it's about this girl in this world where when women have magic, as soon as they get married, they have to have a collar put on them, because as soon as they are pregnant, if they don't have this collar that blocks their magic, it opens their babies up to being possessed by malevolent spirits. And our main character desperately wants to learn magic, loves her magic. She's very good at it, but she also wants to have a family, so she juggles for the whole book trying to figure out what's more important to her. And this is especially in a world where women are put down and aren't seen as strong as men or as powerful, and it was so good. The romance was so great. The friendships were amazing. I laughed, I cried out of anger, I cried because of sadness. It evoked so many different emotions in me, and I absolutely adored it, and I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. The second prompt for History of Magic is to read a book with a dark cover, and I went with the Midnight Circus, which is opposite of the Midnight Bargain, where I hated it. This is a collection of short stories by Jane Yolen, and they were terrible. They were awful. They were just so bad. Almost none of them had a story. The characters sucked. They were so just unnecessary. I thought that they were all going to kind of revolve around a circus, right? But no, there's absolutely no connection between the different stories, and most of them had no story to them, and they just sucked. This also went for Avatar: The Last Pageturner for the Air Nomad section, to read a book with a cover that represents air, and there are harpies which have wings, and that counts as air, but I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. And then the third prompt was to read a book recommended by someone older than you, and for this I went with The Damned by Renee Audier. Now this, I'm counting it because The Beautiful was in a subscription box, which was the first book in this series, and the people who curated the subscription box are older than me. They recommend the series. I loved The Beautiful. I read it last year. It was one of my favorite books of the year. But it's about a girl who comes over from France with a dark secret, and she just gets involved in the politics of vampires in the 1920s in New Orleans. And it was so good. I gave the first one a 5 out of 5 stars. This one I didn't love as much, but I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I cannot wait for the next one. This is the first time Renee Audier has done more than a duology, and I'm very excited to see where she goes next. Okay, and then the next class is Muggle Studies, and the first prompt is to read a comic, and for this I went with Lumberjanes Volume 13. I finished Lumberjanes. Well, I'm caught up on Hoopla, and I am a little disappointed because they've definitely started to go downhill, and I think it's mostly since Noelle Stevenson stopped playing a part in it. I think it started as soon as She-Ra started becoming a thing, and so that took up more of her time, but I just feel like they've definitely gone downhill. And then the last couple in relation to earlier volumes have been really disappointing. This one I did end up giving between like a 3.5 and a 4 out of 5 stars. The next prompt in the NEWTS is to read a book by an author that's a different race than you, and for this I went with Upon a Burning Throw by Ashok K. Banker. This is a retelling of the Mahabharata, which follows two brothers who take this trial by fire to see who will be the heir. But they both go through the trial by fire and they live, but so does a demon princess. I wanted to love this. This also went towards Scallywagathon to read a book that exploded in popularity. I did do 2 pads during Scallywagathon, so a couple of them do have the same prompts. But I just wanted to love this so much, and I just didn't. I didn't care about the 2 princes. I wish we had gotten the demon princess's point of view, because she's the reason why this whole war started. But we never get anything from her. We get like 2 chapters from her dad's point of view, and that's it. I just really didn't care about it. There was no... And maybe this might be because it's just so huge. You expect this huge, amazing, epic fantasy, but it's not. There's no descriptors. I couldn't tell. I would never have been able to tell that it took place in ancient India if it hadn't had an elephant on it and I hadn't known what the Mahabharata is about. And I just was so disappointed in this. I wanted to love it, and I just really didn't. And I ended up giving it, I don't know, probably a 3 because like it's not terrible, it's just my expectations were just way too high. So when I first finished it, I was like a 2 out of 5 stars because I was just so disappointed. But I mean, in reality, it's probably more around a 3. And then the last prompt for this class is to read a contemporary, and I chose Bet Me by Layla something. And this was okay. Again, it's kind of had the opposite effect of 10 Rules for Faking It, where I really liked 10 Rules for Faking It, and then I went downhill. This was opposite, where I wasn't the biggest fan of it in the beginning, but then I did end up liking it in the end. And this is about a girl who accidentally posts a rant on YouTube about men. And she's like, I'm done with having sex. I'm done until I get romanced, until I actually am dating someone. And it starts this whole movement. And our main love interest's best friend puts out a competition in his magazine that whoever could get her to pop her cherry was would get $50,000. Yeah. Yikes, right? Definite yikes. I hated that character so much, and he was just so entitled, and I feel like all of the men in this were just so entitled and just so annoying. I liked the main love interest, but he just was too passive. He let all this happen. He said dude, come on, she's not a piece of meat, but he never actually told her about it, nor did he actually really try to stop it, which I did not like. And he just, yeah, I liked our main character, and I liked her friends, but I was very average, and I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. And then Bet Me was also towards Scallywagathon for Gold Doubloons to read a cover by. All right, for the next class, Potions. For the first prompt, it is to read a book with a sky on the cover, and I went with The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. This is about it takes place in the real world, but it's whenever a city becomes popular enough, someone kind of takes on the role of the city, and they become the soul of the city. But New York has 5 boroughs, so five separate people take on the soul of their boroughs, and they have to join forces to go against kind of the ultimate Karen. They call her the Lady in White, and she is just turning everyone hateful and spiteful and trying to just ruin the world. I really did enjoy this. I don't think I loved it as much as I kind of said in my vlog, because I think kind of the peer pressure got to me, where I was like, yes, I should be loving this. This should be like the best thing I've ever read. It wasn't. It was very good, but I think I'd give it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. The ending didn't make any sense. It was very rushed, and I still don't really know like what really happened. And then The City We Became was for Avatar: The Last Pageturner, the Earthbender Kingdom, to read a book with a black main character by a black author. And then the next prompt was to read a book with an author whose name started with D, and I went with an anthology where only one author's name had started with a D, and that was All Out. This is a collection of short stories about LGBTQ plus characters throughout the ages. I thought this was going to be focusing on real people, and while a couple of them did, it was definitely more fictional, and I did really enjoy it, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And then the last prompt for Potions is to read a book over 450 pages, and I went with Middle Game by Seanan McGuire. I loved this. This follows 2 twins, Roger and Dodger, who were adopted by different families, but then they are able to come together kind of through a psychic connection, and they learn that they were created by this man to bring about this almost heaven, or Eden, if you will, that he wants to get to. I loved this. It's so good. You know, you gotta get past the fact that their names are Roger and Dodger, because it's terrible. But other than that, it was so good. I absolutely adored it. There was only one thing that really kind of confused me, and that was the villain's motivations against our main characters. Because this isn't a spoiler, because it's obvious from the beginning that this man created these characters and then immediately kind of assumes that they're gonna fail and sets out to make sure they fail. And I didn't really understand why, because he created them to try and bring about this paradise, but then tries to make them fail at every turn. So that did confuse me, but I loved it so much that I still gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. All right, we have one more class, everyone. Can you believe it? I can't. And I think that means it's time for me to reveal the truth, and that is that I did complete all of the NEWTS. So let's get on with Transfiguration, and then maybe a couple extra books. So the first prompt in Transfiguration is to read a book with an animal on the cover and the title, and I went with Lumberjanes Volume 12, something about a jackalope. So the jackalope is an animal, it's in the title, and I'm pretty sure there are animals on the cover, it's just not a jackalope. And then this also went towards Avatar: The Last Pageturner, the Earthbender Kingdom prompt to read a book with nature on the cover. And again, this is kind of along the same lines as Volume 13. It's definitely more disappointing than when Noelle Stevenson was writing them, and I gave it again a 3.5 to 4 out of 5 stars. And then the second to last prompt is to read a book with dragons in it, and I went with Memory of Souls by Jen Lyons. This was amazing. I love this series so much. This is the third book in the series. I got an arc from NetGalley and I adored it. I absolutely loved it. It follows characters who are all part of this prophecy to destroy the world. This book, they're all together, it's going forward, and it's so, so good. I loved it. There were some confusing parts, but it just like, I just had to read more, and then by the end, it was just so crazy good. Of course, gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. And then for the last prompt, for the last class in the NEWTS, it is to read a hardcover, and I went with the anthology, The Book of Dragons. Now this, I definitely liked the most out of all the anthologies that I read this month. I did love how dragons were represented in so many different ways. There were 20-something stories in this. I want to say 25, maybe to 20. No, there were 29 stories in this. That is so much, and it was just so, every one of them was so different, and I was just very, very impressed, but I also gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. So that is it for the NEWTS, but if you thought we were done, fools! I read 4 more books. Why? Well, there's a couple reasons, a couple valid reasons. One of them, which is The Stolen Songbird by Daniel Jensen, it's because I DNF'd it. But I count books, if I've read either more than 50% of it or more than 100 pages, I count it because I'm putting in time and effort into reading this book. And this was gonna go for the first prompt in Transfiguration to read a book with a animal in the title, but I just did not like it, and I did end up DNFing it and with like 70 pages to go, and so I didn't count it towards the NEWTS, but I did decide to count it towards my overall how many books I read this month. And then the next book I read was Midnight Sun by Stephanie Meyer, which I absolutely adored. This was just everything I didn't know I needed, but like I did know I needed. I loved Twilight. I was such a Twihard. I was such a fan of Twilight back in the day. And then when those first like 150, 200 pages of this was released, I read that over and over again. So when she announced that it was finally actually coming out, I knew I had to pick it up. I was planning on waiting to read this in September, but yeah, that didn't happen. As soon as I had it in my hands, I was like, nope, I gotta read it. I was ahead of schedule in my NEWTS, so I was like, nope, I gotta read it. I gotta. It was like 650 pages of amazing, and I loved it, and it made me so happy, so I did give it a 5 out of 5 stars. Then there's one book that I can't talk about, but that's a book that I was hired to adapt into a screenplay, and I had to read it this month, but I count it because it's a book that I read, so yes, and I gave it a 4.25 out of 5 stars. And then the last book that I read, it was just because I realized, I'm like, oh my god, I only have, besides what I had to read for the NEWTS, I only had one more book to get to 40. And I just had to. So in the same bind up as Meet Me in Mayfair, I read The Duke of Christmas Present, I think it's called. I was just gonna read the whole bind up, but I didn't like the last 2 stories, so I just decided to count the short stories as their own books. G said that you can do this as long as it counts on Goodreads. It counts in her mind, and both stories are on Goodreads. And I gave that one a 4.5 out of 5 stars. That's my August wrap up. It's huge. I hope you all enjoyed. If you're interested in any of these books and any of my deeper thoughts, please go check out my weekly vlogs, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye.